On January 12, 1888, the temperature dropped 70 degrees in 8 hours. The wind reached 60 miles per hour. The sky turned the color of a bruise going black, and 235 people died across Minnesota, Dakota Territory, Nebraska, and Wisconsin. Most of them were children found in the fields and on the roads and in the drifts between schoolhouses and front doors, some of them still holding hands when the thaw finally came and the search parties went out. One structure in northern Wisconsin held 52 degrees through the worst of it. It was 12 feet by 14 feet. Its walls were 16 inches thick. It had been built by a 14-year-old girl with a hand axe and creek clay and the scraps that a logging company had kicked aside and left to rot. This story begins 5 months before that night on the 23rd of August, 1887, when the girl walked into a field of garbage with $9 sewn into the hem of her dress and nowhere else to go. Her name was Mara Asmundsen. Her father had come from Norway as a young man and worked timber claims across the North Country until the work killed him. Her mother had followed him from the same village, raised Mara in a 2-room house near the Tomahawk River, and died of fever in the summer of 1886, 11 months after her husband. Mara was 13 when her mother died. She was 14 when she walked into the slash field. In between, she lived in the Henderson household, where she woke before the family and went to bed after them, and ate what was left on the plates and slept on a straw tick in the kitchen corner, and told herself it was temporary because the alternative was admitting that it was her life. She was a good worker. She knew how to wash and cook and garden and keep small children from hurting themselves. Mrs. Henderson needed all of those things, and Mara provided them without complaint, and the arrangement held for 13 months until Mrs. Henderson caught fever in August and died within a week. The husband remarried before the month ended, a widow from Wausau with 3 children of her own, and a way of looking at Mara that communicated everything without requiring words. The new Mrs. Henderson stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the straw tick in the corner and looked at Mara and made her assessment in the time it takes to exhale. Mara heard the conversation through the kitchen wall 3 days later. The words were not cruel in the way that requires effort. They were simply practical. There were enough mouths. The Norwegian girl must go. Mr. Henderson gave her $9 the following morning. He explained that this was money her parents had left, that he had held it in trust, that he was sorry for the circumstances that the Lutheran Church in Merrill would help her find a placement with a family who needed domestic help. He said she was a capable girl and would land on her feet. He did not meet her eyes when he said any of it. He did not offer to drive her to town. Mara took the $9 and walked north instead of south. She walked north because her father had described the land near the Tomahawk River the way some men describe a place they love, not with sentimentality, but with specific detail. The kind of detail that means a person has walked the ground many times and paid attention. Good timber, he had said. Cold creek running clear from the ridge. A meadow wide enough for a proper cabin site and along the bank clay. Better clay than anything in the county, Mara deep and pure, the kind of clay a person could build something lasting from. He had said it more than once, and the repetition had lodged in her memory without her understanding why he emphasized it until much later. The logging crews had come through after his death and taken everything worth taking. That much she had heard, but the land itself remained. No one had filed on it. The timber company had purchased the logging rights and abandoned the claim when the good wood was gone, and the land had reverted to the county, and the county had no immediate plans for it, and no homesteader wanted 20 acres of stripped hillside with nothing on it but stumps and debris. So the land sat. Mara had nowhere else to go that she was willing to go. What she found was not what she had imagined, though she had tried to prepare herself for the reality of it. The logging crews had not merely harvested the forest. They had consumed it. The hillside looked the way a carcass looks after the wolves have finished, recognizable in outline, stripped of everything that had given it life. Stumps dotted the slope in irregular rows, some of them taller than she was, their flat tops already weathering gray. Enormous tangles of branches and treetop sections lay where they had fallen, the needles long since turned brown and dry, carpeting the ground in a crackling layer that shifted under her boots. The creek still ran, and she was glad of that, but its banks had been gouged and compacted by the dragging of logs, and the grass along the water's edge had not yet grown back. Everywhere, in every direction she turned, lay the wood the crews had not wanted. Crooked logs that no sawmill would accept. Logs with hollow centers split lengthwise when they fell. Sections too small in diameter to be worth the hauling hardwood species that would sink rather than float down river, pieces that had broken during felling and been kicked aside, pieces rotted at one end where they had lain in wet ground too long. The ground was dense with them, a graveyard of timber that the industry had already judged worthless. Mara stood in the middle of it and turned a slow circle. This was what remained. This was what she had to work with. She made camp that first night under a lean-to of branches propped against a fallen pine, built a small fire, and ate the last of the bread the Henderson household had provided. The bread was 2 days old, and she ate it slowly, making it last. The August night was warm enough that she didn't need a heavy fire, but she kept it going anyway because the light was something, and the dark slash field without it was nothing. She wanted to sit inside. She did not sleep well. She lay on her back and looked at the branches above her and calculated. 6 months before the killing, cold arrived. Less of September ran early. She had $9, which could buy flour and salt and marrow, but not much else. She had a hand axe, her father's, with a handle she had wrapped in rawhide where the wood had cracked. She had the clothes she was wearing and a change wrapped in burlap. She had her mother's Bible, which she did not open, but which she kept near her. She had the knowledge that she could not go back and would not go forward to Merrill and the Lutheran church and placement in another kitchen corner and another family's leftover food. She knew what placement meant. She knew what could happen to a girl alone in another family's house. She had heard enough over 13 months of kitchen work and thin walls to understand the shape of what she was refusing. So she lay in the dark and calculated instead, and the numbers were bad. A proper log cabin required 60 straight logs of at least 8 inches diameter and 16 feet in length. The logging crews had taken every piece of timber that met those specifications. What remained was everything that didn't. A proper cabin needed 6 cords of firewood to carry a person through a Wisconsin winter, 8 cords if you wanted safety rather than survival. Each cord weighed 3,000 pounds. Felling, bucking, splitting, and stacking one cord took a grown man with a proper axe 8 hours of sustained labor. She had a hand axe and 14-year-old arms and no experience with anything larger than a chicken coop. The math was impossible. She knew it was impossible. She ran the numbers twice in the dark to be sure, and they came out the same way both times. She fell asleep sometime before dawn and woke to a slash field still gray with morning and started work. Einar Kvelstad arrived on the 3rd day. She heard him before she saw him, the heavy, deliberate footsteps of a man who had spent decades moving through forest, each step placed with the economy of someone who knows that wasted motion over long distances accumulates into exhaustion. He came out of the tree line to the east and stopped at the edge of her camp and looked at her with the steady, assessing eyes of a man who has seen too much death to be surprised by it but has not grown comfortable with it either. He was a large man going gray with a beard that had gone gray before the rest of him and hands that looked like they had been carved from something harder than flesh. He wore the worn canvas coat of a man who works outdoors year-round. He stood at the edge of her camp and looked at the hand axe leaning against a stump and looked at the lean-to and looked at her fire, which was small and efficient, and gave away nothing about her state of mind except that she had built it correctly. "You are the Asmundsen girl." Not a question. He had known her father. The area was not large, and the Norwegian community within it was smaller still, and her father had been the kind of man people remembered, steady, capable, with the particular dignity of someone who had decided what he believed and lived accordingly. She confirmed that she was. He told her that her father had worked the claim before the company purchased the rights. She confirmed that too. He looked at the slash field, then slowly taking in the full scope of what the logging crews had left, and then he looked back at her, and what crossed his face was not contempt, but something that might have been sorrow for what he was about to say. "You cannot stay here." He said it the way one might observe that frost kills tender plants as a fact of the natural world, not a judgment. "Then you will die." She felt her jaw tighten. "I have nowhere else to go." "Then you will die," he said again with the same flat certainty. "I have lived 9 winters in this country. I buried my wife and my infant son in the winter of '81. The cold took them in the night while the fire burned. I have helped bury 4 neighbors since. I know what kills people out here, and I am looking at the conditions that kill people." He stepped closer, and she saw the scars on his hands, white lines where frostbite had taken the skin down to the underlying structure and left it healed, but altered the way severe burns leave the skin altered. He had paid tuition for what he knew, and what he knew was that the slash field was a death sentence, and the girl standing in the middle of it was 14 years old. He gestured at the debris around them. A proper cabin needed 60 straight logs, minimum 8 inches across 16 feet long. Did she see any timber like that? She did not answer because the answer was visible to anyone with eyes. The loggers had taken it, all of it. What remained was twisted and split and hollow and small and rotten. At one end or the other, garbage that no sawmill would process, garbage that no experienced builder would touch. "You cannot build with this." He said it without pleasure. "No one can. Then I will build something else." His expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes, a slight recalibration, as if she had said something unexpected, in a conversation he had thought he already knew the shape of. He did not pursue it. Instead, he continued his accounting of what would kill her. 6 cords of firewood to survive a winter in any structure she could build. 8 to be safe, each cord 3,000 pounds. A man with a proper axe, 8 hours per cord. She had a hand axe. It would take her 3 times as long. 200 hours of labor for the firewood alone, and she would need a cabin to burn it in, and she would need food, and she would need all of this before the killing cold arrived, which would be October if the season ran early, and November if it ran late, and it was already the 25th of August. "I understand the numbers," she said. "Do you—" His voice dropped slightly. "A girl alone out here cannot cut enough timber to heat a proper cabin. You will die in this pile of rubbish, and no one will find your body until spring." The words landed like stones dropped into still water, heavy and definitive, sending rings outward in all directions. She felt them land. She did not pretend they missed. He looked at her for a moment longer, and something moved behind his eyes that she could not name, recognition perhaps of something he hadn't expected to see there. He told her there was a Lutheran church in Merrill that could find her a placement, a family that needed kitchen help. She would be warm. She would eat. She would live. "I have been placed." Her voice was flat in a way she hadn't intended. "I know what it means." He looked at her then with a different kind of attention, and she understood that he understood. He had daughters once. The past tense of it was visible in his face if you knew what you were looking at. He understood what happened to girls alone in other people's houses, understood it not as an abstract concern, but as knowledge earned through proximity to it. "Then I will pray for you," he said at last, "because nothing else will save you." He turned and walked back into the trees, and she watched him go, and her hands were shaking, though the morning was still warm. He was right about the numbers. She knew he was right about the numbers. 8 cords of wood, 60 straight logs, 200 hours of labor, with tools she did not have starting in late August with winter 6 months out. The math did not change because she wanted it to. She looked at the slash field, at the crooked and hollow and rotten wood that no sawmill would touch, and she looked at it for a long time. Then she walked to the edge of the clearing, where her father had carved his initials into a stump years before. The letters were nearly overgrown, the bark having grown back around them in a slow reclamation of the mark. She ran her fingers across the carved lines. Beneath the stump, wedged into the gap between 2 roots in a way that required deliberate placement rather than accident, she found a tin box. Inside was a letter in her father's handwriting, careful and slanted, and unmistakably his, the same hand that had written her name on birthday notes in the margins of her school books before the school books stopped coming. He had written about the land, about the clay deposits along the creek, deep and pure. He wrote better than anything else in the county, good enough for a proper brickworks. He had written about a man named Grundon. Then the letter stopped. The bottom half was missing, torn away at some point by something, whether accident, intention, and whatever her father had meant to say about the man who owned the only general store in Merrill was gone. Mara held the incomplete letter and felt the absence of the missing half like a hand reaching for something that isn't there. Her father had hidden this letter because someone might come looking for it. That much was clear. Why he had hidden it and what he had meant to say about Grundon and why the second half was missing, those were questions she could not answer from what remained. She folded the letter and returned it to the tin box. She carried the moss to the spot she had already chosen for the hearthstone, a flat rock near the creek bank, solid and level, the kind of foundation a fire could be built on and trusted. She set the box beneath the stone and pressed the stone down over it, and the letter rested there in the dark while she went back to the slash field. The idea came to her on the 15th morning, in the gray hour before dawn, while she was stacking short pieces of wood by her fire. She had been cutting sections from the waste logs with the hand axe, not to build anything, just to clear space and create something usable from the material closest to camp. The pieces were uneven. Some were curved, some were split irregularly, some were barely longer than her forearm. She stacked them out of habit the way she stacked firewood, with the cut ends facing outward and the irregular shapes locked against each other in ways that uniform pieces wouldn't have. She stopped and looked at what she had done. The stack was 3 courses high and holding. The irregular shapes weren't a liability, they were interlocking. A curved piece fit against a straight one. A split piece wedged against a round one. The variation that would have made a sawmill reject them was the same variation that made them grip each other without slipping. She thought, what if there were mortar between them? The memory surfaced without being called, the way certain memories surface when the mind is working on something related. Her grandmother's voice years before Mara was born, describing in letters to Mara's mother the old way of building houses in the mountain communities of their home region. Short pieces of wood and clay, because the long, straight timber required for conventional construction was scarce in the high country. The peasants had built this way for generations. Her grandmother had called it by a word that Mara couldn't fully remember now, but the description was clear enough. Wood ends mortared together into thick walls, each piece too short to be useful in the conventional sense, all of them useful in this one. She crouched beside the stack and looked at the gaps between pieces. Mud would fill them. Clay from the creek bank would be better dense and cohesive, with enough mineral content to bind when it dried. There was sand in the creek bed and sawdust in endless supply across the slash field, both of which could be mixed into the clay to slow shrinkage and prevent cracking. If she added lime, which could be bought in Merrill for little enough, she could slow the freeze-thaw cycle that turned ordinary mud mortar to powder. A conventional log cabin wall was 8 inches thick. One log's diameter sealed with chinking that cracked every winter and let the cold pour through. Everyone who lived in the North Country complained about the chinking. It was the perpetual maintenance problem of frontier construction. The gaps reopened, the chinking fell out. The cold came in. If she cut her pieces to 16 inches, the standard length of firewood, the wall would be 16 inches thick, twice the depth of a log cabin wall, and there would be no gaps because every gap would be filled with mortar that went all the way through. No channel for the wind to find, no thin spot for the cold to exploit. She went to the creek bank and dug her fingers into the clay. It was dense and cold and gray, the consistency of bread dough that has been worked for a long time. She carried 2 handfuls back to her stack and pressed the clay into the gaps between the cut ends. It stuck. It held its shape. It didn't slide. She cut more pieces from a hollow log, the kind Einar had gestured at as an example of garbage, and set them on top of the first courses, pressing clay between them as she went. Then more clay, then a third course. By midday, she had a test section, 3 feet high, ugly and irregular, the logs mismatched in size and shape, the mortar lines uneven where she had applied it with her fingers. She pushed against it with both hands, leaning her full weight into it. The wall did not move. She had not built anything yet. 3 feet of experimental wall was not a cabin, and the winter did not care about potential. But she had demonstrated something to herself that changed the entire problem. The twisted logs, the rotten-ended logs, the hollow logs, the logs too small to mill, and too curved to stack conventionally, they were not useless. They were building material. They were, in fact, ideally suited for this specific method precisely because their irregularity created mechanical interlocking that uniform logs couldn't achieve. The slash field wasn't a graveyard, it was a quarry. She ate the last of her bread that evening and began calculating what she needed. A footprint of 12 by 14 feet, small but achievable, larger than she had first imagined when she thought in terms of conventional construction. Walls 7 feet high, because Einar was right that anything less would be inadequate, and she needed to be right about this. Approximately 2,000 log ends at 16 inches length, sorted by diameter, debarked where possible, mortared in courses. She had cut perhaps 40 pieces in the process of building the test section. The full structure required 50 times that number. She had no more bread. She had barely enough to have gotten this far on. She set snares along the creek that evening, using wire she'd found in the collapsed remains of a small outbuilding near the claim's edge, and she set them the way she thought they should be set, spanning the rabbit runs. She could see positioned at what seemed like logical crossing points. 5 days passed, nothing. Her hand shook when she lifted the axe on the 6th morning. When she stood too quickly, the slash field tilted and reoriented itself in a way that had nothing to do with balance and everything to do with a body that had been burning its own tissue for fuel. She lay on the straw tick inside the lean-to and looked at the branch ceiling and thought with a clarity that frightened her about Merrill, about the Lutheran church, about a clean floor and a warm stove, and a family that needed kitchen help, which was the same as placement, which was the same as a kitchen corner and leftover food and another set of walls that were not hers. She thought about what could happen in those walls. She lay there for a long time. Then she remembered her father's hands, patient and deliberate, crouched beside the Tomahawk River on a day she had been small enough to sit on his knee and watch. Not across the runs, he had said. Not where you can see the path they use. Beside the water where they come to drink before dawn. Low to the ground, loose wire. Let them walk into it, not push against it. She had set every snare wrong. She had set them the way they looked, like they should be set, not the way her father had taught her. She stood up. She pulled all 7 snares and reset them along the creek bank near the clay deposit where the ground was soft and the prints were fresh and the water came within 6 inches of the bank. She set them low and loose, impatient. The next morning there was a rabbit in the 3rd wire. She skinned it with the hand axe and roasted it over the coals and ate everything, the liver and heart, first the way her mother had done in the years before their situation improved, cracking the bones afterward for the marrow. Nothing wasted. By afternoon, her hands had stopped shaking. She mixed mortar and laid 2 more courses on the test wall before dark. And what she felt was not relief, but something more functional than relief. The recalibration of a person who has come back from the edge of a wrong decision and found solid ground again. The skills you need are already inside you. Her father's voice, or the memory of it, patient and unhurried. She had nearly starved because she forgot to use what she already knew. She would not forget again. The cabin's footprint was 12 by 14 feet, which she marked with stakes and string on the ground where the meadow met the tree line on the south side of the clearing. She calculated the wall material, 2,000 log ends at 16 inches sorted by diameter, to maintain consistent course heights, debarked where the wood was sound enough to warrant the labor, mortared with the clay sand sawdust mixture she had been refining over the past week. She had been adding sawdust at a ratio of roughly 1 part sawdust to 4 parts clay, and the test wall had not cracked in the first week of curing, a small confirmation, not proof. By the end of the first week of construction, she had 300 pieces cut and sorted. Her hands had blistered, and the blisters had bled, and the skin had begun the process of hardening into callus. Her shoulders ached with a sustained, low-grade constancy that she had stopped noticing, because noticing it required energy she couldn't spare. She had lost weight she didn't have to lose, and when she caught her reflection in the flat of the creek on still mornings, she saw someone who had aged in ways that had nothing to do with years. The wall rose anyway, 1 course at a time, 1 piece at a time, 1 handful of mortar at a time. It was the 4th of September when Ingrid Holst rode into the clearing on a draft horse that had seen the far side of middle age and carried it with the equanimity of a creature that has stopped expecting comfort. She was a Norwegian widow, somewhere in her middle 30s, with the kind of face that had been weathered by outdoor work into something that didn't signal mood easily, and hands that looked like they had been formed by decades of work that required grip. She had a homestead 2 miles north. She had 2 sons, Carl, who was 12, and Finn, who was 9, and she had been running the claim alone since her husband was killed by a falling tree in 1885. She had heard about the Asmundsen girl. Everyone within 20 miles had heard something about her by now. Ingrid had come to see whether the something had any substance. She climbed down from the horse and walked a slow circuit around the foundation. The first course of cord wood wall was 8 inches above the stone foundation. 16-inch log ends mortared in place, end grain, facing outward a rectangle 12 by 14 feet that was unmistakably real and equally unmistakably unlike anything anyone in the county had built before. "What is this?" Ingrid's voice carried no judgment yet, only assessment. Mara continued mixing mortar. "A cabin. This is not a cabin. This is a woodpile. The pieces are too short to rot through. The mortar seals every gap. The wall will be 16 inches deep when it's finished." 16 inches of what? Firewood. Wood and mortar all the way through. There are no gaps for wind to enter. Ingrid crouched beside the foundation wall and ran her fingers along the mortar lines, pressing with her thumb against the joints. She stood and pushed with her palm. The wall did not flex. She pushed harder. It did not move. "The mortar will crack," she said. "When the freeze comes, the water in the clay expands. By December, you will have gaps you could put your fist through. I'm mixing lime with the clay. It slows the process. When the wind comes, when a January gale hits these walls at 40 miles an hour, it will find the gaps. The mortar goes all the way through the wall. There's no channel for the wind to follow." Ingrid stood and looked at the slash field and then at Mara, and then at the wall rising from the stone foundation. Something in her expression shifted in a way that was not agreement, but was no longer certainty either. She had arrived expecting to confirm that this was foolishness. The wall would not cooperate with that expectation. "You are betting your life on this," she said. "Yes. If it fails, you will have no time to build another before winter." "I know. And you will die." "I know." There was a silence between them that lasted long enough to have weight. Then Ingrid reached into her saddlebag and produced a bundle wrapped in cloth, which she set on a nearby stump without fanfare. Dried venison. She said she had more than she needed. She said she was not asking for payment. She said she was asking Mara not to die and compound her conscience. At the tree line, she stopped and looked back. "The walls will not hold." Her voice carried the particular tone of someone who hopes they are wrong. "But I hope I am wrong." Then after a pause, "My youngest Finn, he's 9 and there's no school within 30 miles. If you are still alive at the end of the month, you will teach him to read. 1 afternoon a week. That is my price." She rode into the trees and was gone. Finn Holst arrived the following Tuesday. He came on foot, walking 2 miles from his mother's homestead, with a slate under his arm, in the face of a boy who has developed a healthy skepticism toward adult claims about what is possible. He stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at the cordwood wall, which had risen to 2 feet in the weeks since his mother's visit, and the expression he wore was the same one Ingrid had worn, not contempt, but a suspended judgment that wanted to see more before committing. He walked closer. He touched the mortar with one finger the way a person touches something they can see as real but cannot quite integrate with what they expected. "Is this going to be a house?" His voice was careful, giving nothing away. "It will be. It looks like a woodpile. Your mother said the same thing." He came close to smiling. Didn't quite. But the suspended judgment shifted slightly in a direction that suggested he was willing to withhold the verdict a while longer. He learned the alphabet in 2 sessions. By the 3rd week, he was sounding out short words, his finger tracking beneath the letters, his lips moving in the focused, effortful way of someone learning a physical skill. By the 4th week, he was reading simple sentences, slow and deliberate, but actually reading, not reciting from memory. He came every Tuesday without needing to be reminded, and he began bringing things. A handful of nails from his mother's barn, a length of rope that had been coiled behind a post unused for 2 seasons. Once a jar of pickled beets that he carried 2 miles without dropping or opening. "For the warm house," he said each time, setting whatever he'd brought on the growing shelf Mara had built inside the unfinished walls. He had named the cabin before it had a roof. He found the dog on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, running into the clearing with mud on his knees and the particular expression of a child who has encountered something that requires adult intervention, but is not sure the adults will agree. There was a boy in the old logging dump near the creek. Someone had left it there. It was so thin you could see the architecture of its ribs through the matted fur. Mara did not want a dog. The arithmetic of her situation did not have room for another mouth. She said so, and she said it plainly, and Finn looked at her with the eyes of a 9-year-old boy who had watched a falling tree take his father and understood at some level below language what it meant to be left somewhere you weren't supposed to be left. She went to look. The dog was wedged under the collapsed frame of an old timber company outbuilding, huddled in the minimal shelter it provided. Medium-sized, indeterminate in breed, with a coat that had been matted into sections by neglect and weather. It did not growl when she approached. It did not wag its tail. It looked at her with the particular stillness of a creature that has made its peace with whatever comes next, and is simply waiting to find out what that is. She had worn that expression herself for 13 months in the Henderson kitchen. "Come on then," she said. The dog followed her back to the clearing and lay down beside the unfinished wall as though it had always lived there. Finn named it Rune after a dog his father had kept before the tree fell, which was as close to honoring his father as he had found a way to come since then. That night, for the first time since Mara had walked into the slash field, something slept beside her. Rune curled against her back, bony and warm, the warmth of a living body that asked nothing except proximity, and the sound of its breathing filled the lean-to in a way that the silence had not. She had not registered the silence as a presence until it was replaced. She lay in the dark and felt the weight of the dog against her spine and understood that the silence had been heavy, in a way she hadn't let herself acknowledge because acknowledging it would have cost her something she needed to keep. Rune became functional before the week was out. It slept across the doorway of the lean-to. It growled at movement in the tree line before she could hear it herself. It followed her to the creek and back to the mortar pit and back to the slash piles and back with the steady devotion of a creature that has chosen its person and intends to take that choice seriously. When Finn came on Tuesdays for his lessons, Rune lay beside them on the ground with his chin on its paws and exhaled with a contentment so total it sounded like something had been resolved. The first time Finn laughed in the clearing, really laughed, the unguarded laughter of a child who has forgotten for a moment to be careful, was because of something Rune did. Mara did not remember afterward what it was exactly, only the sound of it, which was the first laughter that had happened in that space since she'd arrived, and which left something in the air after it faded that hadn't been there before. The walls reached 2 feet by the end of September. Mara walked the perimeter each evening as the light failed, running her hand along the top course, pressing the mortar joints, looking for cracks or separation. None appeared. The test section she had built 3 weeks earlier had gone through its first night below freezing and come through without splitting. Small evidence, not proof, but she was building on it anyway because it was what she had. On the last morning of September, she walked to the edge of the clearing and before starting work and stood for a moment looking at what she had made. A rectangle of cordwood wall 2 feet high, rising from a foundation of dry stacked stone she had pulled from the creek bed and fitted together over 2 weeks of evenings. The walls were ugly in the way that honest things built under difficult conditions are ugly functional before they are beautiful, committed to standing rather than to appearance. They were not what anyone would have built if they had a choice of materials and time and assistance. They were exactly what could be built from what she had. Einar Kvelstad returned on a morning in late October, appearing at the tree line the same way he had the first time, the heavy, deliberate footsteps, the gray beard, the hands like carved oak. This time he was carrying something. He walked to the edge of the clearing and stopped. The walls were 4 feet high now. They rose from the stone foundation in courses of mortared log ends, 16 inches deep, and they were solid in a way that had surprised even Mara when she leaned her full weight against them and felt nothing give. They were not beautiful. The courses were uneven where the log diameters varied. The mortar lines were thick in some places and thin in others. The corners were supported by longer pieces she had sorted for the purpose, fitted together at angles that held by weight and pressure rather than by any formal joinery. Einar looked at the walls for a long time. He said nothing. Then he walked to a stump near the cabin site and set down what he had been carrying. It was an axe full-sized with a handle worn to a dark smoothness by years of palm sweat, the head kept sharp and clean in the way of a man who respects his tools enough to maintain them. "This was your father's." His voice was level. "He left it at my cabin the week before he died. I should have returned it sooner." Mara looked at the axe. Her father's hands had worn that handle to that smoothness. His work had lived in the grain of that wood. She reached for it and felt the weight of it settle into her grip. Heavier than the hand axe, balanced differently, the weight distributed through the head in a way that made the work of cutting feel like cooperation rather than effort. And for a moment, her father was standing at her shoulder, patient, as he had always been patient, waiting for her to feel how the tool was supposed to move. Einar turned to go. He had not commented on the walls, had not said she would survive. At the tree line, he paused without turning back. The walls are 4 feet. Yes, they need to be 7. I know. Then he was gone, carrying neither apology nor concession. Only the fact of the axe he had carried 2 miles through the October forest and left without flourish on a stump. He had not admitted he was wrong, but the axe said something that his voice had not, and she understood both the saying and the limit of it and went back to work. The full-size axe cut through the waste timber in half the time. She was laying 10, sometimes 12 pieces a day when the weather held, and the weather was holding less reliably. Now the first frost had come on the 28th of September, and the mornings came earlier and colder each week. October moved like a held breath, cool and clear and temporary. She worked through it with the knowledge that the breath would release and what followed would not be gentle. By the 1st of November, the walls stood 5 feet high, and Mara Asmundsen had not died in the pile of rubbish, and no one had found her body because she had not left one, and the slash field that no logging company had wanted and no homesteader had claimed had a structure rising from it that was unlike anything else in northern Wisconsin. It was ugly. It was unfinished. It was exactly what she had said she would build. The full-size axe changed the arithmetic of everything. Where the hand axe had required 3 strokes to cut through a section of waste timber, the full-size axe required one, sometimes 2. Where the hand axe had left her shoulders burning after an hour of sustained work, the larger tool distributed the effort differently through the hips and the core and the whole chain of motion from feet to hands, and she could work 3 hours before the fatigue became a liability rather than a condition. She was laying 10 pieces a day in the first week of November 12, when the weather stayed dry and the walls climbed past 5 feet with a steadiness that felt almost like argument. Every course was a point she was making to the empty slash field, to the man who had said 7 feet was what she needed, and then given her the tool to get there, without saying he was giving her the tool to get there. October had been cold and clear and had held. November arrived with the same deceptive steadiness. For the first 2 weeks, temperatures dropping at night, but recovering enough during the day to keep the mortar workable. She had refined the mix, slightly more lime, slightly more sawdust, less pure clay, based on what the test section had shown her about the way the original formula shrank at the joints as it cured. The revised mortar set slower and cracked less. She pressed her thumbnail into joints she had laid 3 weeks earlier and found them dense and resistant, not the crumbling softness she had feared. Small victories, each one, not proof of anything beyond the next course. Anders Lindqvist appeared on a Tuesday morning in the first week of October, a date she fixed later only by working backward from other events, because at the time, she was too focused on the walls to track the calendar with any precision. He came from the direction of the logging road to the west, which meant he had come from the camps rather than from town, and he moved with the particular efficiency of someone who had spent years in timber work, where wasted motion cost more than it does anywhere else. He stood at the boundary of the clearing and looked at the walls, which were at 4.5 feet by then, and he did not say anything for long enough that she had time to lay another section of mortar and set 2 more pieces before he moved. He was perhaps 20, lean in the way of men who work hard and eat what they can with the calloused hands of someone who has been in the woods since adolescence, Swedish by his features and the faint accent that shaped his vowels slightly differently than the Norwegian community around him. He had heard about the Asmundsen girl and the cordwood walls. Everyone within 20 miles had heard something. He pressed his palm against the mortar between 2 courses and held it there, testing with the sustained pressure of someone who knows what structural failure feels like before it becomes visible. He looked at the 16-inch depth of the wall from the top, how far back the interior face sat from the exterior, the distance that represented the difference between this and everything else being built in northern Wisconsin. How much firewood have you burned since you started? His voice was direct, the question practical rather than conversational. None. There's nothing finished to burn it in yet. He was quiet for a moment longer. Then, the roof pitch is too shallow for what you're planning. You'll lose heat through the ceiling faster than through these walls once you have a fire going. The walls will hold the warmth. The roof will let it out. She looked at the stakes and string that outlined the roof framing she had been planning. He was right. She had calculated the wall depth in the mortar formula and the foundation mass and had not calculated the ratio of roof surface to floor space with the same rigor. He came back the next morning with tools she hadn't seen him carrying the day before: a draw knife, a mallet, a folding rule. He didn't announce a plan. He walked to the deadfalls along the creek and began stripping bark in long, efficient pulls, working with the draw knife in a way that suggested he had done it 1,000 times before. By afternoon, he had enough material to add a second layer to the existing roof framing, with dried moss and sawdust packed between the layers as a thermal barrier. He worked through the afternoon without speaking, and she worked beside him on the walls, and the clearing had the particular quality of a space occupied by two people who are each concentrating completely on what they are doing. The cabin temperature rose 3 degrees that night, measured against the external air. He returned the next morning, and the morning after that. He found reasons a weakness in the corner joinery he had noticed and wanted to address a drainage issue along the north foundation, where snowmelt would pool against the wall base come spring. The reasons were real, each of them, but Finn noticed their accumulation before Mara allowed herself to. During a Tuesday lesson in mid-October, the boy looked up from his slate with the candid attention of a child who has learned that adults frequently fail to acknowledge obvious things, and delivered his observation in the tone of someone reporting a weather condition. "He keeps coming back." Nothing more. Finn returned to the slate. Mara told him to read the next paragraph, and her face was warmer than the small fire in the outdoor ring justified. She was running low on flour by the 18th of October, which meant the 12-mile walk to Merrill. She had been putting it off because every hour of walking was an hour not spent building, and the November deadline she had set for being inside was moving toward her faster than the walls were moving toward 7 feet. But flour and salt were not negotiable. She packed the hand axe, left Rune at the clearing. The dog refused, initially circling back twice, before she was firm enough about it and walked south on the logging road. Merrill in October was a market town at the end of a season, the particular atmosphere of communities that have been working hard since spring and are beginning to feel the weight of what the winter will require. Wagons loaded with supplies, the smell of sawdust from the mills on the river, farmers in from outlying claims moving with the purposeful efficiency of people who have a long list and limited time. Grundon's general store occupied the largest building on the main street, a 2-story structure with a covered porch and a sign that could be read from the far end of the block. Carl Grundon stood behind the counter with the settled authority of a man who has been in the same place for long enough that the place has shaped itself around him. He was perhaps 45, thick through the chest, with small eyes that tracked everything in the room, and a face that had learned to express whatever the situation required without revealing what lay underneath. He knew who she was before she reached the counter. The girl from the slash field. Not hostile, not warm, assessing the way he might assess a commodity of uncertain grade. "I've heard about your project." She put her money on the counter. Flour and salt, the quantities she needed. "That land isn't yours." He began filling her order without hurry, measuring with the practiced ease of a man who has done it 10,000 times. Timber rights were company property. When they abandoned the claim, the land reverted to the county. "You're occupying public ground without authorization." "The county hasn't objected." "Not yet." He set the flour on the counter. "But I've written to the board. A child can't hold property. When you freeze this winter, and you will freeze, I don't want there to be any confusion about who the land belongs to." She took her order and held his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. He did not look away. He had the eyes of a man who has won most of his arguments by the time the argument begins. Then, as her hand touched the door, he said it, the thing that stopped her cold on the threshold, the thing that she would carry back to the slash field and turn over in her mind through every hour of work that followed. "Your father had the same foolish attachment to that land," casually, as if he were commenting on the weather. "Look where it got him." She turned. He was wiping the counter with a cloth, his face expressing nothing beyond the mild engagement of a man completing a routine task. She asked him what he meant. He told her that accidents were accidents, that the land had buried better people than her, and wished her a good day. She walked the 12 miles back to the slash field with the flour heavy on her shoulders and the question heavier in her mind. Grundon had spoken as though he knew something about her father's death that went beyond the public account. A falling tree, a steep hillside, the kind of accident that happened to loggers with sufficient regularity that it barely warranted investigation. He had spoken about it as a consequence, as something that followed from a decision her father had made about the land rather than as an unrelated event that had simply occurred. She thought about the incomplete letter in the tin box under the hearthstone. She thought about the missing second half, the torn edge, the name Grundon, written just before the break. She could not pursue it now. She had walls to build and a deadline that did not care about her father's history or Grundon's implications. She filed it in the place where she filed things that were real and important and not yet actionable, and went back to laying mortar. The second letter found her on a Thursday in early November. She had been dismantling a collapsed logging outbuilding a quarter-mile from the clearing, salvaging the doorframe, the only sound piece of dimensional lumber in the entire slash field for her cabin entrance. The structure had been built by the timber company for temporary storage and abandoned with everything else, and most of it had deteriorated beyond use. But the doorframe was Douglas fir old growth and had stayed dry enough under the partial shelter of the collapsed roof to remain sound. When she pulled a board from the interior wall, a folded piece of paper fell from the gap between the stud and the sheathing. Yellowed and brittle at the edges, the folds set deep by time. But the handwriting was her father's, the same careful slanted script she had been looking at under the hearthstone for 2 months. She unfolded it with hands that were not as steady as she would have preferred. It was the second half of the letter, or perhaps a different letter that continued the same story. She could not be certain because the first letter's bottom half was missing, and this one had no beginning. But the content made the connection clear enough. Her father had found the clay deposits. He had recognized their quality, deep pure, the kind of mineral-rich clay that brick manufacturers paid premium prices for. He had told his partner about it. His partner was Carl Grundon. They had agreed to file a joint claim on the land once the timber company's lease expired, a business arrangement between two men who had apparently trusted each other. They would build a small brick works together. The clay was good enough to supply a regional market. The numbers were sound. Grundon had gone to the timber company instead. He had told the company's foreman that Mara's father was conducting unauthorized prospecting on company land during working hours in violation of his labor contract. The company had terminated her father's employment immediately without references in the middle of the logging season, when every crew in the North Country was already at full complement and no reputable operation was adding men. The only work her father had been able to find was on a hillside clearing operation that the experienced men in the area already knew was dangerous. Unstable timber on a steep grade, the kind of job that went to men who had no better options. The tree fell on the 11th of June, 1886. Her father died the same day. Grundon had filed his first inquiry about purchasing the land 2 weeks after the funeral. The last lines her father had written, perhaps knowing something was wrong, perhaps only prudent in the way of a man who has already been betrayed once and understands now that prudence is not optional, were direct. If anything happens to me, the land is Mara's. Grundon owes me. He owes me everything. She sat in the collapsed outbuilding with the letter in her lap and the afternoon light coming through the broken roof in angles that shifted as clouds moved overhead. The floor was cold through her clothing. Rune, who had followed her from the clearing, lay beside her with its head on her knee and breathed steadily while she read the letter a second time and then a third. Grundon had not killed her father. Not with his hands, not directly, but he had taken the ground out from under him, had traded a man's livelihood for a chance at clay deposits, and the man had taken the only work available on a hillside that experienced loggers avoided, and the tree had fallen the way trees fall on unstable grades when the conditions are wrong. And now Grundon was trying to do to the daughter what he had done to the father, except that this time the mechanism was legal rather than personal. A letter to the county board, a formal purchase offer, a quiet consolidation of what he had schemed to acquire all along. She folded the second letter carefully and carried it back to the clearing. Set it on the shelf beside the first letter and the pour of pickled beets and the coil of rope Finn had brought 3 weeks earlier. She did not show it to anyone. She did not send word to the sheriff or the county board or the Lutheran minister in Merrill, who might have been moved by it. She was 14 years old and a girl, and the trash cabin girl at that, the girl who was building a woodpile on public land and waiting to freeze. A dead man's letter in a county where the dead man's former partner was the man who supplied the town would not be received the way it deserved to be received. Not yet. Not until she had something more than paper to stand on. She had walls to build. Everything else was a problem for spring. She moved into the cabin on the 10th of November. It was not finished. The door was a salvaged plank propped against the opening and held in place by a wooden peg. The single window was a square hole covered with paper that had been soaked in rendered fat to make it translucent. It admitted light and stopped wind, but communicated nothing about the world outside beyond whether it was day or dark. The floor was packed, earth hardened by 2 months of her footsteps into something almost solid. The chimney was a column of clay-mortared stone, crooked in the way of structures built by a single person, working without a plumb line rising 6 feet above the hole she had cut in the roof. The first fire inside burned on the 12th of November. The smoke did not draw well. Initially, she spent an hour adjusting the chimney cap before the draft reversed and the smoke began moving upward rather than pulling against the ceiling. When it finally drew, she sat on the dirt floor with Rune pressed against her leg and watched the fire establish itself and felt the temperature in the small space begin to climb. Outside, it was 12 degrees above zero. Inside, by evening, it was 52. She pressed her palm against the interior face of the wall and held it there. The mortar was warm, not warm from the fire, which was 10 feet away, but warm from having absorbed the heat of the fire all day and begun the slow process of releasing it back into the space. The wall was doing what she had reasoned it would do, what the physics of mass and thermal conductivity required it to do, though she did not have those words for it. What she had was the warmth moving through her palm and into her hands, steady and quiet and real. She had been right. The test section had suggested it. The math had supported it. But knowing something in theory and feeling it through your palm against the wall you built with your own hands are different kinds of knowing, and the second kind settled into her chest in a way the first kind never could. Sheriff Arndt and Carl Grunden rode into the clearing on the first day of November. Before the cabin was livable when the wall stood at 5 feet and the roof was framed but not yet covered. She had been laying mortar on the 6th course when she heard the horses. Rune's warning was low and sustained not the sharp alarm of something dangerous, but the steady signal of something that required attention. Finn was there for his Tuesday lesson, sitting on the stump with his slate, and he stood without being asked and moved to stand beside Mara in the unhurried way of a boy who has decided where he is when things become uncertain. Sheriff Arndt was a tall man with the careful manner of someone who enforces rules he did not write and occasionally does not agree with. He had the look of a man who had rehearsed what he was going to say and was following the rehearsed version because departing from it would require him to think on his feet about things he would prefer not to think about on his feet. He did not dismount. He explained that she was occupying county land without authorization. He explained that Grunden had filed a formal complaint. He explained that the county board would meet in December to consider Grunden's offer to purchase the parcel and that if the sale went through, she would be removed. He said he was advising her to vacate before the first snowfall. Grunden sat his horse a little behind and to the right of the sheriff, and his face wore the particular smoothness of a man who has already won and is present only as a courtesy to the formality of the process. He said that he had offered to purchase the 20 acres at fair market value. He said the board would likely approve. He said all of this pleasantly as a man who can afford pleasantness because the outcome is not in question. Mara looked at him steadily. And my father, did he vacate too? The smoothness on Grunden's face did not change, but something moved behind it very fast like a fish turning in dark water, visible for a moment and then not. Your father died in an accident. Everyone knows that. Everyone knows, Mara said and stopped there and let the echo of it sit. Arndt shifted in his saddle. He apologized. He said he was sorry. He meant it. She thought he was a decent man in a position that required him to do things decent men are sometimes asked to do. They rode away, and the clearing felt different after they were gone, not emptier exactly, but altered the way a room is altered by a conversation that has changed the terms of something. That night, she sat inside the unfinished walls with a fire that was still learning to draw properly and looked at the 2 letters on the shelf above the stone she used as a table. She had no lawyer. She had no money for one. She had no adult who would speak for her in the county seat, no family name that carried weight in morale, no standing in any room where decisions about land were made. She was 14 years old, and the law governing property in Wisconsin did not recognize her right to hold it, regardless of what her father had written in any letter. She could leave. She knew how to do that. She had done it once already from the Henderson kitchen, and the walking was not the hard part. The hard part was what waited on the other side of the leaving. She sat with that for a long time, and Rune lay beside her with its chin on her knee, and the fire made its small sounds, and outside the November dark was full of the particular silence of northern Wisconsin in the weeks before the first serious snow. Finn arrived early the next morning with his slate and a bundle from his mother potatoes, and a smoked fish wrapped in cloth that still held some of the warmth of the house it had come from. He stood in the doorway of the unfinished cabin and looked at her face with the direct attention of a child who has not yet learned to pretend not to notice things. "Are you leaving?" She looked at him, 9 years old. No school within 30 miles, reading sentences by himself 3 weeks after she had shown him the alphabet on a stump in a slash field. He had called this place the warm house before it had any warmth in it. "I don't know," she said, because it was the truth. He set the slate on the ground and sat down cross-legged beside Rune, one hand resting on the dog's back. He didn't argue. He didn't make his case. He was a boy who understood that some things were not his to decide. But his hand on the dog's back and his presence in the doorway said what he wasn't going to say aloud, that she was the only teacher he had ever had, and that he had learned to read in a slash field from a girl who was building a house from garbage, and that the warm house was named the warm house because he had named it that when it was still a woodpile, and that he would like her to still be here next Tuesday. She picked up the slate. Page 12, third paragraph. Read it out loud. She was not leaving. Ingrid returned on the 20th of November. She rode into the clearing and stopped her horse and sat there looking at the cabin, a structure that had not existed 8 weeks ago, that had risen from the floor of a slash field that everyone in the county had written off as worthless. She dismounted and walked its perimeter as she had walked the perimeter of the foundation on her first visit, touching the walls this time, rather than just observing them, her palm flat against the mortar, in the way of someone who needs physical confirmation for what her eyes are telling her. "It's warm." Her voice held something that was not quite surprise. She was not a woman who was easily surprised, but was its close neighbor. "The wall itself is warm. The fire has been burning for 8 days. The heat moves into the mortar and the wood. It comes back out overnight, even when the fire burns low." Ingrid was quiet for a long moment, looking at the exterior face of the wall with the expression of someone revising a substantial assumption. She had been certain about the mortar cracking. She had been certain about the wind finding gaps. She had said so clearly and without hedging, because she was not a woman who hedged. The wall was making her account for the gap between what she had been certain of and what was in front of her. "Finn reads to his brother every night," she said at last. "I hear them through the wall. He sounds out the words I can't quite make out, and then reads the sentence again once he has them." She took potatoes and dried venison from her saddlebag and set them on the stump that served as Mara's outdoor work surface. "If these walls hold through January, through the real cold, not November cold, then I was wrong about everything." She mounted her horse at the tree line. "I hope I was wrong about everything." The walls reached 6 feet by the 22nd of November. 7 feet, the number Einar had stated as the necessary threshold by the 12th of December. She finished the chimney properly in the last week of November, extending it above the roof line to the height that created the pressure differential needed for reliable draft. The door frame she had salvaged from the outbuilding was fitted and hung on leather hinges. The window remained greased paper, but she added a second layer and sealed the frame with strips of cloth dipped in clay slip, and the draft that had been finding its way through the corners of the frame stopped. December arrived, and the temperature began doing what temperatures in northern Wisconsin do in December, dropping at night into the single digits and recovering to the 20s during the day, a rhythm that was cold but not yet the killing cold, not yet what the old-timers called real winter. Inside the cabin, the temperature held between 45 and 55 degrees through the month. She burned perhaps a quarter cord of wood in the entire month of December. She had estimated a full cord. The thermal mass was performing beyond what she had allowed herself to plan for. The thick walls and dense log ends absorbed heat from the fire during the hours it burned hot, then released that heat slowly through the night, slowly enough that when she banked the coals at bedtime and woke before dawn, the cabin was cold but not freezing, the walls still radiating back the warmth they had stored. She understood the principle without the vocabulary for it, the way a person can understand leverage without knowing the word. Grundon's pressure intensified in the weeks after the sheriff's visit, and the form it took was both effective and invisible in the way that power exercised through economic control tends to be. Anders had been coming to the clearing every day for 6 weeks. He had finished the roof insulation and moved on to other things, addressing a drainage issue along the north foundation, building a storage shelf inside the cabin, helping to split and stack the firewood pile that had been accumulating since October. He worked without being asked to continue and without discussing whether he would return in the manner of someone who has made a decision and is enacting it rather than announcing it. Then he stopped coming. No explanation arrived with the stopping. 12 days of daily presence, and then nothing the 12th, the 13th, the 14th, the 15th. Mara continued working. She noticed the absence the way she had noticed the silence before Rune arrived, not as an acute pain, but as a condition, a quality of the days that had changed. Finn arrived for his Tuesday lesson with the expression she had come to associate with news he had been asked to deliver. He sat with his slate and did not open it, which was the first sign that the lesson was not the first thing on his mind. Grundon had told Anders directly in the store in front of other customers, in the casual public way of a man who wants the message understood as widely as possible, that anyone who did business with the trash cabin girl would find that they had lost the ability to do business at his store. Anders bought everything from Grundon. Every homesteader and logger and farmer within 30 miles bought everything from Grundon. There was no alternative within a day's travel in any direction. The store was the only one. Anders had sent his apology through Finn. He said he couldn't fight Grundon. He said he hoped she understood. She understood. He was not a coward. He was a man without leverage in a situation where Grundon held all of it. And fighting that kind of power when you have no counterweight is not courage, it is just loss. She understood it and did not blame him and felt the absence of him in the clearing with a sharpness she had not fully anticipated. The pressure from the pulpit came the same week. Finn reported Reverend Halverson's Sunday sermon with the precision of a boy who has recently discovered that he can hold language in his memory and reproduce it accurately, and who finds this skill newly interesting. The Reverend had spoken about the sin of pride, about a young woman in the parish who had set herself above the wisdom of her elders, who was building a monument to her own vanity, who was living outside the boundaries of proper conduct and inviting God's judgment through her stubbornness. The congregation had been asked to pray for her repentance. He meant you, Finn said, in case that had not been clear. It had been clear. Mrs. Edberg's contribution to the campaign was more intimate in its damage. She was the wife of the dry goods merchant and the primary node in the social information network of Merrill. What she said on Monday at the fabric counter was established as established fact by Friday at the post office. What she said that week was that the Norwegian girl in the slash field was living in improper circumstances, receiving visits from an unmarried man without a chaperone or family present, conducting herself in ways that a decent community could not ignore. The fact that Anders had stopped visiting was irrelevant to the rumor, because the rumor had already been built and furnished and moved into before the visiting stopped. Ingrid heard all of it. She did not come to the clearing. Finn continued his Tuesday lessons, walking 2 miles each way on his own, but his mother's packages of food arrived through his hands without any note or message attached. Charity administered at one remove, the distance itself communicating something about what the town was costing Ingrid to maintain even this indirect connection. Mara had been alone before. She had been alone in the Henderson kitchen, sleeping on a straw tick and eating what was left, and she had told herself it was temporary. She had been alone when she walked into the slash field with $9 and a hand axe and no certainty about anything except that the alternative was worse than the uncertainty. That kind of alone was uncomplicated by expectation. She had not yet been anything to anyone in that place, and so the absence of connection was simply the baseline. This was different. This was the absence that comes after presence. This was knowing that Anders had been in the clearing every day, and now wasn't that Ingrid had been riding in with supplies and conversation, and now communicated through a 9-year-old boy that the town had assembled a version of her that bore no relationship to who she actually was and had decided to govern itself accordingly. You cannot build walls against that kind of cold. It finds the gaps that mortar cannot fill. She sat with it at night after Rune had settled and the fire was low, and the walls were doing their quiet work of radiating stored warmth back into the cabin. She sat with it and did not pretend it wasn't there, because pretending it wasn't there would have cost her something she needed for the walls. Then she got up in the morning and mixed mortar. Finn arrived one Tuesday afternoon, not with his slate, but with the folded piece of paper that he handled with the careful attention of a boy who has been told this matters. His mother had given it to him at the door of their homestead and told him not to open it before he got there. He had not opened it. He handed it to Mara and waited. Inside, a county land deed. 20 acres the parcel that included the slash field in the creek in the meadow where the cabin stood. Purchased from the county board for $14 in cash plus filing fees. The board had met 3 days earlier. Grundon had offered 12. Ingrid Holst had offered 14. The board, which had a preference for transactions it did not have to think about too hard, had accepted the cash in hand over the promise of cash to come. The deed was filed in Ingrid's name with a written trust arrangement that transferred the land to Mara Asmundsen upon her reaching 21 years of age, consistent with Wisconsin property law. Ingrid had had a county clerk notarize the trust arrangement and had written its terms into her will. The note in Ingrid's handwriting was brief. Don't thank me. Pay me back when you have it. Don't die on my land because someone should own this ground who understands what can be built from what other people throw away. Mara read it 3 times. She pressed it against her chest with both hands, the deed and the note together. Ingrid's $14 and the county clerk's seal, and the sentence about what can be built from what other people throw away, and she held it there until her hand stopped shaking. The land was safe. Grundon had been outbid by a woman who had told Mara the walls would not hold, and then quietly gone, and bought the ground the walls were standing on. Old Bergman found her at the creek on the morning of the 10th of January. He was a farmer who had been working the land north of Merrill since before the timber companies arrived Norwegian by ancestry and American, by 50 years of accumulated experience with this particular piece of the North Country, with its weather patterns and its soil, and the specific way it behaved when the seasons shifted in certain directions. He was close to 70 and moved with the economy of a person who has learned to conserve energy because the body's account of it is not inexhaustible. He came down the creek path from the north and stopped when he saw her. Bad storm coming. He said it without prelude, the way people report facts that do not require context. I've seen sky like this once before in '73. Too warm for January, too quiet. The muskrats have been sealing their lodges for a week. The birds moved south 3 days ago, not the usual movement, the panicked kind all at once. She looked at the sky. It was clear and blue and the temperature was 44 degrees, which was warm enough that the icicles on the cabin eaves had been dripping since mid-morning. When? She asked. Tonight maybe. Tomorrow morning. When the sky goes green to the northwest, don't go outside. He looked at the cabin walls from where he stood. Your walls are thick, that will matter. He continued down the path without elaborating. She went inside and brought in every piece of firewood she could carry and stack. She checked the door. She checked the chimney. She sealed the gaps around the window frame with strips of cloth she had been saving for other purposes. She cooked a pot of stew from the last of the venison and the potatoes Finn had brought, eating slowly, not because she was particularly hungry, but because the act of preparing for something is one of the ways a person manages the specific anxiety of not knowing exactly what they are preparing for. Rune would not settle. The dog moved from the door to the fire, to the window, to the door again, its nails clicking on the packed earth floor, its ears rotating with constant small adjustments as it tracked something in the frequency range below what she could hear. She knew the meaning of that kind of restlessness. She had known it since the morning she had reset the snares, the way her father had taught her, the morning she had understood that knowledge sometimes announces itself through the body rather than the mind. She went to Merrill on the morning of the 11th, 12 miles in the false warmth of a January thaw, the snow soft in the air carrying the wrong kind of mildness for the month, not the natural warmth of a seasonal break, but something that felt held pressurized like the stillness before a door blows open. At Grundon's store, she told the men at the counter that a storm was coming. Real storm, the kind that killed people. She had been warned by someone who knew this land. The birds and the muskrats already knew the signs were clear to anyone who had been watching. Grundon smiled in the way of a man performing tolerance for an audience. The men at the counter found it worth of a laugh. She went to the church and told Reverend Halverson, who listened with folded hands and the expression of a man receiving information that does not fit the categories he uses to evaluate information. Only God knows the weather, he said. We shouldn't trust the superstitions of old men who read bird behavior. She tried the sheriff's office, where Arndt was polite and genuinely regretful, but explained that he could not shut down a town on the basis of a farmer's reading of animal behavior. She tried the schoolhouse, where the young teacher from the city looked at the clear, warm sky and said the children would go home at the regular time. Mara stood in the middle of the main street of Merrill and looked at the people around her loading wagons, buying goods, moving through the ordinary business of an ordinary afternoon, and understood something that she had been learning piece by piece since August. You cannot make people hear what they have already decided not to believe. The only thing she could do was build her walls thick enough to survive what was coming without their help. She walked back to the slash field. 12 miles in air that felt like a held breath. She brought in the last of the exterior firewood. She filled every container she had with water. She fed Rune from her own portion and didn't recalculate the math of it. She checked the door one more time. Then she sat by the fire and waited. And the afternoon passed, and the sky outside the greased paper window stayed blue, and the temperature held at 44 degrees, and nothing happened. She opened the door at sunset and looked northwest. Blue, clear, beautiful. The kind of evening that made Wisconsin seem like the easiest place in the world to live. She went to bed. She was checking the firewood stack outside at noon the next day, the 12th of January, 1888, when the world ended its pretense. She heard it before she saw it, a sound like a waterfall that kept getting louder, like a river that was somehow airborne and moving toward her at a speed that waterfalls don't move. She turned. The horizon to the northwest was gone. In its place was a wall, black and green and churning, stretching from the ground to the upper atmosphere, the whole of it moving toward her faster than anything that large should be able to move. She had perhaps 30 seconds, maybe less. Her coat was inside the cabin. She had taken it off that morning to use as an additional layer over the coldest corner of the north wall, a precaution she had taken after noticing that corner ran a degree or two cooler than the rest. And she had not put it back on when she stepped it outside because the day was warm enough, and she was only going as far as the woodpile. She ran. The wind hit her before she reached the door. Hit her the way walls hit people, not the yielding push of ordinary wind, but a physical impact that drove the breath from her lungs and dropped her to her hands and knees before she understood it had happened. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in the time it took her to stand up, then dropped more. The cold was not like cold she had experienced before. It was aggressive, purposeful, finding every exposed surface with a speed and completeness that felt like intention. She could not see the cabin. She could not see anything beyond the wall of horizontal snow that had replaced the air. She felt along the ground until her hand struck wood, the edge of the firewood stack along the south wall. She followed the stack piece by piece, hand over hand, until her palm found the cabin wall, and then she followed the wall to the doorframe, and then she found the latch by touch and wrenched it and fell inside. The door slammed shut behind her. Rune was already against the far wall, pressed into the corner, trembling in the sustained deep muscle way of a creature whose nervous system is registering danger at every frequency simultaneously. The baked coals in the stove still held heat. She fed them with shaking hands and watched the fire catch and begin to climb, and the temperature inside the cabin was 41 degrees and rising, and outside the sound was unlike anything she had heard before. Not a storm sound, but a siege sound, continuous and absolute. She held her hands near the stove, not against it, not touching the metal, but close enough that the radiant heat could work on the damaged skin without shocking it. Her grandmother had described this once in a letter that her mother had read aloud, a letter about a neighbor's child who had been pulled from a snowbank and held too close to the fire and had lost 3 fingers to the damage that followed. You warm them back the way the cold took them, her grandmother had written slowly with patience, letting the blood find its own way home. Forcing it only closes the doors you need open. The fingertips cycled from white to mottled purple, to a red that hurt in the specific way that healing hurts the pain of blood returning to places it had been driven from. She accepted the pain as information and kept her hands at the same distance from the stove and watched the temperature gauge she had mounted on the interior wall climb past 45, past 50 to 52, where it stabilized. Outside, the temperature was dropping with a speed that had no precedent in anything she had experienced. At 9 in the evening, it read 11 below zero. At midnight, 30 below. She did not open the door again after midnight because the reading at midnight was enough to tell her that opening the door was a transaction she could no longer afford. Rune had stopped trembling by 10 o'clock. The dog lay beside the stove on the piece of folded canvas Mara had put there for it in November, chin on paws, eyes tracking her movements with the steady attention of a creature that has decided its job is to monitor its person and is executing that job with full concentration. She pressed her palm against the interior wall. The mortar was cool to the touch, not cold, not the cold of a wall that has lost its stored warmth to the night. Cool and holding and already beginning to give back what it had gathered over the past 8 days of fire. At some point in the first hour of the 13th, while the temperature outside reached depths she could no longer measure and the sound of the wind had ceased to be a sound and become instead a condition of existence, Rune raised its head. The dog did not growl. It looked at the door with the fixed, absolute attention of a creature that has heard something specific within a frequency that the storm had buried under everything else. The ears moved in small adjustments, triangulating. Then Mara heard it too. Beneath the freight train roar underneath the siege of it, a sound that did not belong to the storm. Rhythmic, deliberate, someone knocking on wood. She crossed to the door and pressed her ear against the plank and listened. And through the wood, through the storm, she heard a voice. Barely, frayed at the edges by the wind and by whatever the person outside had already spent getting here. Please. The word stripped of everything except its function. Please let us in. She opened the door. The wind came in, first horizontal and immediate driving snow against the back wall before she had registered what she was seeing. 2 adults and 3 children, the adults carrying the smallest child between them, all of them coated in the white of people who have been moving through a blizzard for a long time. The child being carried was not moving. Eric Halverson and his wife Clara. Their 3 children. Their cabin roof had gone under the snow weight. An hour earlier, the timbers had cracked in sequence, Clara told her later, like a sentence being spoken one word at a time. And then the center had dropped and the snow had come in, and Eric had grabbed the children in the dark, and they had run into the white because running into the white was better than staying under what had just been their roof. Get to the stove. Mara had the smallest child, the girl 4 years old named Bet, before Clara had finished crossing the threshold. The child was not unconscious. She was somewhere past the state where consciousness is the relevant question. Her lips had a color that had nothing to do with cold as a temporary condition, and everything to do with cold as a process that was completing itself. She did not put the child near the fire. She sat on the floor with her back against the south wall, the wall that faced the fire and had been absorbing its heat all day, and held the child in her lap and wrapped her own coat around them both, and placed the child's hands between her own hands and held them there. The wall behind her was radiating steadily. The coat trapped that warmth and the warmth of Mara's body, and she held the child's hands between her palms and applied gentle, sustained pressure, working the circulation back into the fingers by increments so small they were nearly imperceptible. This was the knowledge her grandmother had sent across an ocean in a letter that her mother had held and passed on. Not dramatically, not as a lesson, just as information offered in context, the way people who know things pass them to people who will need them without knowing when the need will arrive. It had traveled 3 generations to reach this moment, and Mara received it the way you receive something you didn't know you were carrying until the occasion for it presents itself, and the knowledge is simply there, complete and certain, as though it had been waiting. The child's fingers began to cycle, white to mottled, mottled toward red. Mara kept her hands in the same position, the same pressure, patient, with a patience that was not calm. She was not calm. She was operating at a level of sustained intensity that had no room for calm, but was something more durable than calm. The patience of someone who understands that the outcome depends entirely on the quality of attention brought to the next 5 minutes. Bet's eyes opened 40 minutes later. She looked at the ceiling of the cabin and then at the woman holding her hands, and she did not cry. She said, "Where is Papa?" And Clara, sitting against the east wall, exhaled a sound that contained several months of accumulated dread, finally releasing. They were not the last to knock. Mrs. Edberg came 20 minutes after the Halversons. She arrived with her 3-year-old son Thomas pressed against her chest, his face buried in her coat. Her own face, a landscape of damage. The skin on her cheekbones had split along the bone where the wind had stripped the moisture from it, and the splits had dried open in the cabin warmth, dark lines that followed the contours of her face like a map of something. She could not form words at first. She extended the boy toward Mara with both arms, the gesture saying everything that her voice could not organize yet. Thomas was not speaking. He sat in his mother's lap after she had been brought to the stove, and his eyes were open, and he was present in the technical sense, breathing, tracking movement, responsive to touch. But he had gone somewhere interior, that the storm had driven him to a place children find when the external world becomes more than their nervous systems can integrate. Mara recognized the geography of it. She had lived there herself during the 13 months in the Henderson kitchen, had gone quiet in the same specific way, making herself small enough that the world might not notice her and require more than she had. She did not speak to Thomas directly. She did not instruct him or encourage him or try to coax him back with words. She looked at Rune, who had been watching the situation with the alert neutrality of a dog taking inventory, and she made a small gesture, not a command, just an indication of direction. And Rune rose from the canvas by the stove and crossed the room and stopped beside Mrs. Edberg and looked at Thomas with the quiet gravity of a creature that has decided this is where it is needed. Thomas's hand moved first, slowly the way trust moves when it has been damaged, not toward exactly, but no longer away. His fingers found the fur along Rune's neck, then his palm, then both hands pressing into the warmth of the dog's coat with the sustained, deliberate pressure of someone who is relearning through the simplest possible means that the world still contains things that are warm and solid and present. Doggy warm. 2 words barely above a whisper, the first sounds Thomas had made since the storm began. His voice was rough in the way of something that has been sealed shut and is opening. Mrs. Edberg pressed her hand over her mouth. The tears that came did not soften the split skin on her cheeks. They found the cracks and followed them, and she did not wipe them away. And the sight of it was the kind of image that does not require any accompaniment to mean what it means. Reverend Halvorsen arrived wrapped in an altar cloth. He had been in the church when the windows gave way in the first hour of the storm. The lead came loose in the wind, and the glass came after, and the temperature inside the building had dropped 40 degrees in 20 minutes. And he had taken what he could find and walked the half-mile to the cabin he had preached against from his pulpit, because it was the only structure between the church and the river whose walls he believed were likely to still be standing. He did not say this directly. He came through the door with the altar cloth wrapped around his head and shoulders and said nothing beyond the information that the church windows were gone, and Mara said, "Get to the stove," and he got to the stove. The widow Angstrom came after him, 53 years old, alone since her husband's death, her cabin holding until the fire went out, and her hands became too stiff with cold to restart it. She arrived apologizing for the intrusion, as though arriving at a place of warmth after your fire has gone out, in a blizzard were a social imposition rather than a survival decision. Mara put her next to the stove and told her to stop talking and get warm. The Brandt family came as a unit, father-mother, the twin boys who were 8 months old and had been held against their mother's body inside her coat for the duration of the walk. Martin Brandt's ears were the wrong color on the outer margins. The frostbite damage already established the tissue, having crossed the line between at-risk and compromised. Mara looked at his ears and then at the space left in the cabin and began the spatial calculation of 18 people in a room built for one. 18. That was the count when she had attended to everyone and taken inventory of the room. Eric and Clara Halvorsen and their 3 children, Mrs. Edberg and Thomas, Reverend Halvorsen, the widow Angstrom, the Brandt family of 4, 3 more she knew less well, a farming family from the south end of the county, whose name she would not learn until the storm was over. Herself, Rune, 18 people in 12 by 14 feet. The air was thick with the moisture of multiple bodies breathing in a small space with the smell of wet wool and wood smoke and the particular animal warmth of people who are cold and getting less cold. Children were crying in the way of children who have passed through terror into the relief of warmth, which sounds similar to continued fear, but is different in kind. Someone was coughing against the east wall. The temperature gauge read 52 degrees, and the firewood stack inside the door, which she had built for her own use over several months, was diminishing at a rate she had not planned for. She calculated. She had brought in enough wood for 3 days as a solo occupant. With 18 people in the space, with the door opened and closed repeatedly, with the ambient heat loss that came from 18 bodies cycling the air, the stack would last perhaps 2 days. Maybe 2.5 if she kept the fire low between feedings and let the walls carry the load. The walls could carry it. That was the central fact. The thermal mass stored in 8 weeks of fires would not release instantaneously. It would give back what it had slowly through the night, a slow tide of stored warmth that continued regardless of what the fire was doing. She did not need to roar the flames to keep the room survivable. She needed to keep the flames alive and let the walls do the arithmetic. She organized the space by the only criteria that mattered. Children in the corners nearest the walls, where the radiated warmth was most consistent. Adults in the center closer to the fire, but in the cooler air that rose through the middle of the room. The injured and the compromised nearest to her where she could monitor them. She communicated this to Eric Halverson, who had the size and the presence to enforce a spatial arrangement in a crowded room, and Eric communicated it to the room, and the room arranged itself. Carl Grunden came last. She had been stoking the fire and had not heard the sound beneath the storm at first, and Rune had been the one to signal it, the dog lifting its head from the floor beside Thomas, the ears adjusting, the attention redirecting to the door. The knock that followed was not tentative. It was the knock of a man who has spent everything getting to the door and has nothing left for courtesy. She opened it. Grunden was there, and he was not alone. He was holding his daughter Ingrid, 7 years old, against his chest with both arms, and the child's head was against his shoulder, and her eyes were closed, and her lips were the color that lips turn when the body is making decisions about where to send the remaining warmth, and the extremities are not winning those decisions. The child's body had the particular limpness of something that is not unconscious, but has moved past the stage where consciousness is the body's primary concern. Grunden's face had been rearranged by what the night had cost him. The smoothness was gone, the managed surface, the small eyes that tracked and assessed the expression that communicated exactly what he wanted it to, and nothing he didn't. What was there instead was what remained when all of that had been stripped away. A man who loved his daughter and had run out of options and was standing at the door of the only structure for miles that he believed was still holding 50 degrees, and the structure belonged to the girl he had spent 4 months trying to destroy. He did not say please. He looked at her and looked at Ingrid, and the word would not organize itself. Some states of need are beyond the grammar of requests. Mara looked at the child, 7 years old, blue at the lips, limp at the joints, cold in the specific and advanced way that it has a limited window for reversal. "Come in," she said. "Get to the fire." Grunden crossed the threshold. The door closed behind him. 19 people in a cabin built from waste timber and creek. Clay by a 14-year-old girl with a hand axe and a dead man's knowledge, and $9 sewn into the hem of her dress. The temperature outside was 42 degrees below zero. The temperature inside was 52 degrees above it. The difference was 94 degrees and 16 inches of wood and mortar, and the walls were holding every degree of it without complaint and without failure. The way things built correctly hold what they are built to hold, indifferent to whether anyone believes they can. She took Ingrid from Grunden's arms and carried her to the south wall. The warmest wall, the one that faced the stove and had accumulated more direct radiant heat than the others. She sat with her back against it the way she had sat with Bet Halverson, using the wall's stored warmth as a supplement to her own body heat. And she held Ingrid's hands between her palms and began the slow, patient work of bringing the child back through the stages her body had moved through. The cabin was quiet in the way that crowded spaces are sometimes quiet when everyone in them is paying attention to something more important than conversation. 18 people watched or did not watch, breathed, held their children, stared at the fire. The wind outside maintained its siege. The walls gave back their warmth degree by degree. Ingrid's fingers began to cycle. It took longer than Bet Halverson's had. The child had been out in it longer or had less reserve to draw from, or both. Mara kept her hands in position and did not rush and did not measure the time by anything except the color of the fingers and the quality of the child's breathing and the subtle changes in muscle tone that signaled whether the process was moving in the right direction. After an hour, Ingrid opened her eyes. She looked at the ceiling, which was made of salvaged boards and bark shingles, and was not the ceiling of any room she had ever been in. She looked at the walls, which were made of log ends and mortar, and were unlike any walls she had seen. She looked at the woman holding her hands, and then she found her father across the crowded room, and she said, "Papa," in the voice of a child returning from somewhere far away. Grundon had not moved from where he had stood when he entered. He was against the west wall with 18 other people between him and his daughter, and when she said his name, he crossed the room, without appearing to navigate the bodies between him and her. They moved, or he moved between them, and then he was there kneeling on the packed earth floor beside Mara, and he gathered Ingrid against his chest and pressed his face into her hair, and his shoulders moved once a single contained convulsion, as though something structural had shifted. And then he was still. He did not cry. He made no sound. But the one movement said everything that his controlled surface had spent decades preventing him from expressing. And the people in the room who saw it understood what they were seeing, and the people who didn't see it understood it from the quality of the silence that followed. Ingrid looked at Mara over her father's shoulder with the direct, unmediated attention of a child who has not yet learned to observe other people through layers of assumption. "Are you the one who built the warm house?" "Yes. Finn told me about it. He said the walls are made of firewood and mud. He said you built it all by yourself." A pause, the child processing something. "He said you're the smartest person he knows." Mara turned back to the stove before anyone in the room saw her face change. She said that the fire needed tending, which was true, and she tended it, and the moment passed into the room's general warmth. Grundon saw the 2 letters on the shelf above the stove. She saw him see them, the slight redirecting of his eyes, the brief stillness that followed recognition. He knew her father's handwriting. He had read what her father had written, or enough of it. He knew what the letters contained. The cabin was 19 people deep in every direction, and the storm was making its argument outside, and Grundon was kneeling on the floor of the structure he had spent 4 months trying to eliminate, and his daughter was alive because of it, and the letters were 3 feet from his head. "Did you know what happened to my father?" Her voice was level, not loud. The room was small enough. That level was sufficient. The cabin went quiet in a way that was different from the quiet that had preceded it. This was the quiet of people who have stopped whatever they were doing because something in the air has changed. Grundon looked at the letters. He looked at Mara. He looked at Ingrid, who was watching him with the complete attention of a child who does not yet know how to watch people partially. He opened his mouth. It closed, opened again. For a moment, she thought he was going to speak all of it, the partnership, the timber company, the letter he had sent to the foreman, the hillside, the tree, the date in June. For a moment, the weight of it seemed to be moving toward his voice. "I cannot undo what happened." The words arrived as though they had traveled a long distance and arrived depleted. "That is not what I asked." He held her gaze. She held his. The letters sat on the shelf between them, and the fire was behind her, and outside the storm was still making its case. And Ingrid was warm in her father's arms, and the wall behind Grundon's back was radiating steadily into the room, doing what it had always done regardless of who was pressed against it. His silence answered her question with more completeness than any words could have managed. The guilt was not hidden. It was present in his face the way mineral content is present in creek water, coloring everything visible to anyone who knew what they were looking at. "Give me the child," Mara said. "The blood has to keep moving. She needs to be walked slowly, not too warm, not too fast." She took Ingrid and walked her in small circles in the available space, 2 steps this way, 2 steps back, the child's small feet on the packed earth floor, the warmth of the walls surrounding them both, and Grundon sat against the west wall and watched and said nothing more. The first night was 36 hours long. Mara did not sleep. She moved through the room in the intervals between fire feedings, stepping over and around the people who had arranged themselves across the floor in the configurations that warmth and exhaustion and proximity had produced. She checked the children. She monitored Martin Brandt's ears, which had reached the stage where the skin was blistering, superficial frostbite, rather than the deeper damage she had feared, the tissue complaining, but not dying. She made sure the widow Angstrom had not been pushed to a cold corner by the unconscious geometry of a crowded room. She fed the fire every 90 minutes, keeping it steady rather than hot, working with the walls rather than against them. She divided the food on the morning of the second day. Everything she had: potatoes, the remaining dried venison flour mixed with water, and cooked flat on the stovetop, divided into 19 portions and distributed without comment or ceremony. Each piece was smaller than a child's palm. No one asked for more. No one complained. The gratitude in the room had a physical quality, a weight, as though the 19th person in the cabin was the awareness of how close each of them had come to not being there at all. Eric Halverson spoke into the quiet of the second afternoon, his voice carrying the flatness of a man delivering a verdict against himself. My cabin has notched log walls, proper construction, experienced builder. I burned 2 cords of wood in 3 days before the roof failed. He paused. My wife kept the children in bed under every blanket we owned. The water bucket froze solid every night. Another pause. This cabin is warmer than mine has ever been. Built by a 14-year-old girl from the garbage the logging company kicked aside. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of a room reconsidering something it had held as settled. Widow Angstrom, from her position near the window, asked how much firewood the cabin had burned since the storm began. Halverson told her what Mara had told him: a quarter cord, perhaps slightly more. A quarter cord, against the 2 cords Halverson had burned in a cabin that still failed. Against the 3 and 4 cords other people in the room reported burning before their structures gave way or their fires went out. The math was in the room with them, and it was not comfortable math for anyone who had been certain about what was possible and what was foolish. Mrs. Edberg spoke from her place against the west wall, Thomas still folded into her, one of his hands resting in Rune's fur. Her voice was quiet enough that the room had to attend to it. I said terrible things about you. Not a confession seeking absolution, a statement of fact delivered with the directness of someone who has decided that the only currency left worth spending is honesty. I told people you were living in improper circumstances. I told them this place was a monument to pride and that God would judge it. Her hand moved against her son's hair. I was jealous. You had courage I didn't have. You built something real with your hands, and I had never built anything except other people's reputations. A pause. I have no excuse. I'm sorry. Mara looked at Thomas, who was watching Rune with the focused, trusting attention of a child who has found the one thing in the room that asks nothing of him. The door was open when the storm came, she said. It's still open. Reverend Halverson prayed that evening. Not the way he prayed on Sundays, not with the projection and authority and comfortable certainty of a man who believes the universe is arranged according to his understanding of it. He prayed on his knees in the corner of a cabin he had called a monument to vanity, in a voice that was quieter than the fire, with his hands folded and trembling. Forgive me for my blindness, he said, speaking to something that was not the room, but that the room contained. I stood in your house and spoke with certainty about things I did not understand. I judged this child, and I was wrong. I used your name to excuse my own smallness. I have nothing left to offer except the truth, and the truth is that I was a fool. The storm made its sound, the walls made their warmth. The prayers settled into the room without requiring a response. Near midnight on the second day, the door opened again. Not a knock this time, just the latch lifting, the door swinging inward against the wind, and a figure falling through the opening and collapsing onto the packed earth floor in a way that was not the collapse of someone choosing to sit down. He was covered in snow from boot to crown. His coat had frozen into a shell that maintained the shape of the wind rather than the shape of the man inside it. His eyebrows were solid with ice. His lips were the color of old ash. His jaw was locked against a cold so total that the muscles had simply refused further movement. He lay on the floor and lifted his head, and his eyes found Mara through the accumulated damage of 2 miles in 40 below wind with zero visibility. And what was in his eyes was not just the physical extremity. It was the specific relief of a man who has reached the thing he came for. Anders Lindqvist. He had not come because the storm had driven him out. His cabin was holding. He had supplies. He was safe where he was. He had come because he was sitting in his own warmth alone, and he could not stop thinking about her in the wall she had built without his help after he had withdrawn his, because a man with a store had threatened his supply account. He had sat with that for 2 hours. He had stood up and sat back down. He had gone through the argument on both sides, the practical argument, the survival argument, the argument that said he could not help anyone if he was dead, the argument that said a man who chooses flour and nails over a person has made a choice he has to live with. He had put on everything he owned and opened his door. 2 miles in conditions that the storm wanted to be the last 2 miles anyone walked. He had lost the path a quarter mile out and found it again by feel, by the way the ground changed under his feet, by the direction of the wind, and what it told him about the orientation of the landscape. He had arrived because he had decided to arrive and had not allowed the deciding to become negotiable once he'd made it. She was beside him before she had fully processed what she was seeing. She got his coat off. It had to be peeled rather than unbuttoned, the ice releasing it from his shoulders in sections, and she wrapped him in the only blanket she had not already distributed, and she brought his hands to the now familiar position between her palms and began the work she had done 4 times already that night. His jaw unlocked after 20 minutes of warmth. His first coherent words came in pieces, the voice of wreckage that the cold had been at. "I'm sorry, Grundon told me to stay away, and I stayed away. I chose my account over you. I sat in my cabin tonight, and all I could think was I couldn't stand not knowing." She did not tell him it was all right. It was not all right he had stayed away when the pressure came, and that had cost something real. And naming it as all right would have been a courtesy that cost more than it was worth. But she also did not say what she might have said in a different kind of moment, because he had walked 2 miles into a storm that was killing people a quarter mile from their own front doors, and that walk said something that his words were not required to repeat. "You're here now," she said. His hands tightened around hers, the grip returning as the warmth did, and then his eyes closed and his breathing changed, and he was asleep with the completeness of a person whose body has simply stopped negotiating. She held his hands until the grip relaxed fully into sleep, then set them gently on his chest and went back to the fire. She fed it one more piece of wood. She checked the temperature gauge, 51 degrees. She pressed her palm against the wall, warm, steady, faithful. The wall did not care who slept against it or what they had said or what they had chosen when the choosing was easy. It only held the heat and gave it back. That was all it had ever done. That was all she had asked it to do. The storm peaked in the hours before dawn on the 14th and began its slow withdrawal as the sun rose behind the clouds that did not break but did lighten. The roar diminished by increments, not suddenly, not with any gesture of resolution, but by the gradual reduction of a force that had spent itself. By mid-morning, the sound had become something that could be called wind rather than siege, and by early afternoon the snow had stopped entirely, and the world outside the greased paper window was brilliant with the particular hard-edged light of post-storm Wisconsin, everything surface and shadow, nothing soft. Mara opened the door. The slash field had ceased to exist as a landscape. In its place was a white plain of absolute uniformity, the stumps and debris and remaining cordwood all buried under drifts that in places reached the eaves of the cabin's north wall. The tree line was still visible, the dark verticals of the surviving trees standing against the white like marks on a page. The sky was a color that had no name between blue and gray, clean in the way that skies are clean. After violence emptied out neutral offering, nothing. 15 below zero. Warm by comparison. She stood in the doorway and breathed air that cut the lungs with precision and looked at the world the storm had made, and behind her, inside the walls she had built from the slash field's garbage, 19 people were alive. Eric Halverson was the first to go out. He dressed without speaking, nodded to Mara, and stepped into the drifts. He sank to his thighs. He did not look back. He returned 2 days later with a list written on the back of a feed receipt, standing in the cabin doorway, with the flat voice of a man who has learned to report catastrophe at one remove from himself in order to get through the reporting. 235 dead across the upper Midwest. Minnesota-Dakota Territory. Nebraska-Wisconsin. 213 of them children caught by teachers who had looked at the warm morning and seen no reason not to send them home at the regular hour. The Lindgren family 4 miles south, the father found frozen 30 feet from his barn, the mother and 3 children in their cabin with the fire out. The youngest was 4. She was in her mother's arms. The Gustafson boy, 11 years old, found standing upright in a field with his schoolbook still under his arm. He had been walking in the right direction. He was a quarter mile from home. Einar Kvelstad, found 20 feet from his own front door. 52 years old, 9 Wisconsin winters. The scars on his hands from the winter of 1881, when the cold had taken the skin and left the rest. The man who had stood at the edge of Mara's camp in August and told her plainly without cruelty that she would die in that pile of rubbish and no one would find her body until spring. The man who had carried her father's axe 2 miles through October forest and set it on a stump without apology and then walked away. He had gone out to his barn when the storm hit. He had been 20 feet from his door when the wind took his sense of direction, or his legs, or both, and the 20 feet had become permanent. The pile of rubbish held 52 degrees. The man who named it rubbish lay under the snow 20 feet from his door in the winter he had not survived. Mara looked at her father's axe against the wall, the handle worn smooth by her father's hands, inherited by Einar's care, passed to her without ceremony. She thought about the walk Einar had made in October with the axe in his hands, 2 miles of forest, and the axe placed on the stump, and the statement that the walls needed to be 7 feet, and then the departure. He had not admitted she was right. He had brought her the tool to prove it herself. She wished she had a way to give him back the warmth he had carried to her door. She did not cry. There were 19 people who needed water heated and food prepared, and a path dug through the drifts to the woodpile, and the practical work of surviving the days immediately after a catastrophe. She did that work. She kept the record of Einar in the part of her that kept records, and she let the rest of it wait. The reckonings came one at a time over the following week, each one different in shape, each one carrying the weight of what the storm had clarified. Halverson came back from his rounds on the 4th day and asked to learn how to build the walls. He stood in the cabin doorway and said it without preamble when the snow melted. If she would teach him, he would teach anyone who asked. He nodded once and went back out into the drifts. His wife came the next day alone and pressed her palm against the exterior wall and held it there in the cold for a long time. When she finally took her hand away, she was crying, and the crying had nothing to do with the wall itself. It was for the water bucket that had frozen solid, while her children shivered under every blanket the family owned, for the knowledge that it had not needed to be that way, for the specific grief of understanding too late what had been available all along. The widow Angstrom asked one question: could a woman build these walls alone? When Mara said yes, something in the widow's face opened in the particular way that doors open when a key that has been missing finally appears. Reverend Halverson came on the 5th day. He stood in the clearing and removed his hat and held it in both hands and spoke to Mara with the voice of a man who has stripped something down to its foundation and found the foundation smaller than he had believed it was. I preached against you from the pulpit. I called this place a monument to vanity. I said your pride would be your undoing, and I told my congregation to pray for your repentance. He held his hat. I was wrong about everything. I used God's name to justify my own smallness, and I don't expect your forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I know. She looked at him for a moment. He looked smaller than he had on the Sundays when she had seen him from a distance passing through Merrill on errands, the man who occupied the largest building on the block and filled it with certainty. The door was open when the storm came, she said. It's still open. He put his hat back on. He thanked her. He walked away. The following Sunday, he preached about humility, about the sin of certainty, about a child who had built something that every experienced adult in the county had called impossible, about what it meant to confuse your own limits with the limits of the possible. He did not name her. He did not need to. Sheriff Arndt came on the 7th day with a document. The county board had met in an emergency session in light of the storm, in light of what the cabin had done during it, in light of the number of people who had survived in it. While proper structures failed around it, the board had declined Grundon's petition. The land remained in trust under Ingrid Holst's name as filed. He also handed her the November eviction notice already torn in half. He said he should have torn it in November. Mrs. Edberg did not come back. She had said what she had said during the storm, and she did not supplement it, but the gossip stopped completely overnight, as though a mechanism had been switched off. Nothing more about improper circumstances. Nothing more about monuments to vanity. The silence was its own kind of accounting, the kind that costs a person who runs on noise more than the noise itself would have cost. Carl Grunden came on the 9th day after the storm alone on foot. He walked into the clearing from the road with the deliberate pace of a man who has rehearsed this walk many times and discovered that rehearsal does not make the actual walk easier. Rune raised its head but did not growl, only watched with the alert neutrality it reserved for situations it was still assessing. Grunden stopped 10 feet from the door and looked at the walls. He took his time with it, looking at the 16-inch depth visible from the top, the mortar lines the salvage door frame fitted into the cordwood, with the jury-rigged elegance of a structure built from whatever was at hand. He looked at all of it, and then he looked at Mara, and then he looked away. He produced a letter from his coat, a formal document written on the store's stationery, signed and dated, withdrawing his claim petition to the county board. She took it, read it, folded it. "And my father," she said. The clearing held the specific silence of a place where something important is being decided. The cold was still present, but had lost the killing quality. It had become ordinary cold, the kind that Wisconsin lived with for 6 months a year and worked around and called winter. Grunden's face moved through several configurations without settling on one. He opened his mouth. He had come here knowing this question would be asked, had walked the 10 days since the storm, knowing that the letter was necessary but insufficient, and still the words would not organize themselves into anything that bore the weight of what they needed to carry. "I cannot undo what happened." He said it the way a man says a thing he knows is insufficient, and says anyway because it is all he has left. "That is not what I asked," she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. The 2 letters were on the shelf inside her father's careful slanted script, describing a partnership and a betrayal in a hillside in the 11th of June, 1886. Grunden knew the contents. He had known them since the moment he saw the letters on the shelf during the storm, had spent the entire night in the cabin, knowing what was 3 feet above his head, knowing what it said, knowing that she knew. His silence confirmed everything his voice would not deliver. It filled the space between them with the completeness of a confession, not because silence is confession in the legal sense, but because some silences carry the shape of what they are not saying, and this one carried it plainly. "Go," she said. He turned. He walked back through the slash field, past the stumps and the buried debris in the creek whose clay deposits he had spent a man's life and a man's trust to acquire. He reached the tree line and passed into it and was gone. She stood in the clearing and looked at the space he had occupied until there was nothing left of his presence to look at, and Rune sat beside her in the snow, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say that the moment had not already said. Carl Grunden left Merrill before the end of January. He sold the general store to a family named Kessler, who had come up from Oshkosh looking for an established business in the North Country. He boarded a southbound train on a Thursday morning, and no one in the county received word of him again. The Kesslers extended credit to every homesteader within 30 miles without conditions, without leverage, without the particular pressure of a man who understood that the person who controls what you need to survive controls everything else as well. The store became what a store is supposed to be, a place where people buy what they need and go home. Mara did not speak of Grunden again. She did not show the letters to the sheriff or the county board or anyone who might have used them as instruments in a legal proceeding. The letters stayed on the shelf where they had survived the night that had changed everything beside the jar of pickled beets and the coil of rope and the other objects that Finn had brought from 2 miles away as offerings to a warm house that did not yet have any warmth in it. They were her father's words. They belonged to her. She did not owe the world her father's pain as currency for anything. The spring came the way Wisconsin springs come slowly, grudgingly, the snow holding into April before the ground softened enough to confirm that the season had genuinely changed. The creek ran clear again. The buried debris of the slash field reemerged as the drifts receded and the meadow came back into visibility, and the tree line showed the first tentative green of trees that had survived and were beginning to say so. People came. Halverson built a cordwood storage shed in March as a learning project before attempting anything larger. His wife reported that it held heat better than the main cabin. By April, they had begun laying the foundation for a cordwood addition to the house itself. The widow Angstrom arrived in May, 53 years old, no one to help, presenting herself at the clearing on a morning in early spring and saying simply that she was ready. Mara spent 4 days at the widow's homestead, showing her each step how to sort the wood by diameter, how to mix the mortar, how to layer the sawdust insulation in the wall cavity, how to read the surface of the drying mortar for the early signs of shrinkage that required adjustment. The widow's walls went up slowly. They went up. A family arrived from 20 miles south who had heard the story through the network of neighboring homesteaders. The girl in the slash field, the trash cabin, the 52 degrees during the worst blizzard in 50 years, the 19 people who had walked to her door in the dark and been let in. They stayed a week and learned and went home and built their own. Mara taught everyone who came. She refused payment every time. When people offered money, she said the wood was the logging companies and the clay was the creeks, and the mortar formula was her grandmother's memory, that she had only assembled what was already there, and the generosity of the statement was not modesty but precision. She had put together what others had left behind, and the only thing that had been entirely hers was the decision to believe it could be done. Ingrid Holst came in late April with both boys. Carl, who was 12, moved around the perimeter of the cabin, examining the wall construction with the systematic attention of someone who is already planning what he is going to build. Finn dropped from the horse before it stopped and went directly to Rune with the urgency of a boy who has been separated from a dog he loves for 3 months and considers this a serious injustice. Ingrid walked the perimeter as she had walked it before, once, twice pressing her hand against the mortar that had taken a night of 42 below zero and emerged without a single fissure. "I told you the mortar would crack and fall out before December," she said. "Yes." "I told you the wind would go straight through." "Yes." "I told you were building a woodpile, not a house." "Yes." "I was wrong about everything." 3 words carrying 6 months of reconsidered certainty delivered without qualification or supplementary explanation. Just the fact of it offered directly. She looked at the walls for another moment, then at Mara. "This spring I'll add a room to my cabin using your method. Carl will help with the stacking and the mortar. You'll show me how." "I'll show you, Carl. You'll show anyone who asks. You won't charge for the teaching." "Not a question." "I didn't invent anything," Mara said. "The mountain people back east built this way because they didn't have long timber. My grandmother described it in letters. I only remembered." Ingrid looked at her with an expression that had moved beyond assessment into something else, the expression of a woman who recognizes a kind of strength that does not announce itself. "You remembered something that kept you alive when 235 people died. That is worth more than invention." She gathered her sons and mounted her horse. At the tree line, Finn turned back and waved with the full-arm enthusiasm of a 10-year-old who does not see the point of small gestures. Rune barked once. Mara waved back. One afternoon in late summer, Mara stood at the edge of the slash field and looked at the place where her father's initials had been carved into a stump that was now barely distinguishable from the new growth coming up around it. The meadow grass had reclaimed the ground where the debris had been cleared. Small trees were coming up in the gaps between stumps, reaching for the same light the old forest had reached for, patient and indifferent to what had happened here before they arrived. She had the 2 letters with her, not to show anyone, not as evidence, not for any external purpose, just to read one more time in the open air before returning them to the tin box under the hearthstone where they had spent the winter. Her father had hidden them because someone might come looking. Someone had come looking. The someone had been outbid by a widow with $14 and had boarded a southbound train and was not coming back. She folded the letters carefully and returned them to the tin, pressed the hearthstone back into its position above them. The stone sat over the letters the way it had sat over them through the night that had changed everything, and the fire had burned over the stone, and the warmth had moved through the walls, and the walls had held. The knowing was her grandmother's. The building was hers.